You can tell everything about a person by the way they treat someone who has nothing left, my husband used to say before cancer took him 8 winters ago. I didn't understand what he meant until the night I gave my boots to a homeless man sitting alone in the snow. The wind cut through downtown Chicago like broken glass that evening. January had wrapped the city in ice for nearly 3 straight weeks, and the sidewalks along Grant Park shimmered under the pale glow of streetlights. I pulled my wool coat tighter around my chest as I hurried home from the grocery store with 2 paper bags digging into my numb fingers. At 67, the cold settled into my bones differently than it used to. Every step felt heavier after dark. Every gust of wind reminded me I wasn't young anymore. The cashier at Miller's Market had warned me a storm was coming overnight, which meant the temperature would likely drop below 10 degrees before midnight. Most people were already rushing home to warm houses and family dinners. I was heading back to a 1-bedroom apartment with flickering heat and leftover soup in the refrigerator. Still, I told myself I was lucky. At least I had somewhere to go. I almost didn't notice him at first. He sat alone on an icy park bench near the frozen fountain, completely still except for the trembling in his shoulders. Snow dusted the sleeves of his thin gray coat. His hands were red from the cold, curled tightly against his chest. But it was his feet that stopped me. He wasn't wearing shoes. Only a pair of soaked socks stretched over skin that looked pale against the snow. People walked past him without slowing down. A younger man in a business suit glanced briefly in his direction before looking away. 2 teenage girls crossed the street to avoid him entirely. The old man lowered his head further, as though he'd grown used to becoming invisible. I should have kept walking too. My apartment was still 6 blocks away, and my toes were already numb even inside my leather boots. They were the only winter boots I owned. Harold bought them for me 15 years earlier after I slipped on black ice outside our church parking lot. A good pair of boots is cheaper than a broken hip, he joked while helping me lace them up that Christmas morning. I still heard his voice every time I wore them. I slowed down near the bench. The man looked up carefully, almost cautiously, as if expecting me to tell him to leave. His face was weathered with deep lines around his eyes, and silver stubble covered his jaw. Despite the cold, there was something strangely dignified about him. Not proud exactly, just tired in a way that felt deeper than exhaustion. "Sir," I said softly, "where are your shoes?" He gave a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Lost them a few days ago." His voice was smooth, educated even, the kind of voice that once belonged in boardrooms or lecture halls. Not on a frozen park bench. I glanced down again at his feet. Snow clung to the wet fabric of his socks. My chest tightened painfully. "You'll freeze out here tonight," I whispered. He shrugged lightly, like a man discussing tomorrow's weather instead of his own suffering. Wouldn't be the first cold night. I stood there longer than I should have. The wind pushed against my coat while traffic hummed somewhere beyond the park. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I set my grocery bags down on the bench beside him and sat carefully on the frozen edge of the concrete planter. My fingers trembled as I untied my boots. The cold hit instantly through my thin socks, sharp enough to make my breath catch. The man stared at me in confusion. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "what are you doing?" I pulled the boots off and placed them gently beside him. "Take them." His expression changed completely then. Not shock exactly. Something sadder. Like he had forgotten kindness still existed. "I can't accept these," he said quickly. "You need them." "I'll be fine," I replied, even though the icy pavement was already burning through my stockings. Nobody should freeze alone. For a long moment he simply looked at me. Snow drifted quietly between us while the city rushed on around the park without noticing either one of us sitting there in the cold. Then he asked the strangest question. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" I thought about my empty apartment, my distant son, the silence waiting for me every night after work. And suddenly the answer felt simple. Because I know what it feels like when the world stops seeing you. By the time I reached my apartment building, I could no longer feel my feet. The icy sidewalk numbed them completely after the first 2 blocks, and every step home became slower than the last. I kept my head down against the wind while carrying the groceries carefully so the paper bags would not split from the melting snow. Cars rolled past with fogged windows glowing gold from heater vents and dashboard lights. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed while climbing out of a warm restaurant. Life continued normally for everyone else. That was the strange thing about loneliness. The world never paused long enough to notice it. My apartment sat on the third floor of an aging brick building on the north side of Chicago. The elevator had been broken for almost 4 months, and the landlord kept promising repairs that never came. By the time I climbed the final stair, my knees ached so badly I had to stop outside my door to catch my breath. Inside, the apartment felt exactly the way it always did in winter. Quiet. The old radiator hissed unevenly beneath the window, pushing out just enough warmth to keep the pipes from freezing. I set the groceries on the kitchen counter and stood there rubbing my hands together for nearly a minute before removing my coat. The silence pressed against me harder than the cold ever could. Years ago, Harold used to fill every corner of this apartment with noise. Baseball games on television, coffee brewing before sunrise, soft whistling while reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. Even after 40 years of marriage, he never learned how to move quietly through a room. Sometimes I missed those ordinary sounds more than anything else. I opened the refrigerator and placed the groceries inside one item at a time. Milk, eggs, a can of tomato soup, half a loaf of rye bread that had been marked down because it expired the next morning. Retirement money only stretched so far these days, especially after rent increased again last fall. My part-time cashier job at Miller's Market helped cover utilities, but barely. Most months I counted dollars the way other people counted calories. Carefully. Constantly. I glanced toward the small armchair beside the living room window where Harold used to sit every evening before he got sick. 8 years later I still had not moved it. The fabric had faded near the armrests, and one of the wooden legs wobbled slightly, but I could never bring myself to replace it. Some things felt too connected to memory to throw away. I heated the soup slowly on the stove while snow tapped softly against the window pane. The weather report on the radio warned residents to stay indoors overnight due to dangerous wind chills. I thought about the old man sitting alone in the park and wondered if he had found shelter somewhere warmer. Maybe he had gone to one of the emergency warming centers downtown. Maybe someone else had stopped to help after I left. I hope so. The image of his face stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because he looked homeless. Chicago had thousands of homeless people, especially during winter. What stayed with me was the way he spoke. Calm, measured, educated, like someone who once belonged to a very different life. I carried my bowl of soup to the small table near the window and sat down carefully. Across the street, a young couple struggled through the snow carrying shopping bags and laughing at something only they understood. Their apartment lights turned on moments later. Warm yellow curtains closed against the storm. I looked away before the ache in my chest grew heavier. My son Daniel used to call every Wednesday night after dinner. At least he had before marrying Vanessa 3 years ago. The calls became shorter after the wedding, then less frequent. Eventually holidays turned into rushed visits filled with awkward silences and careful excuses about being busy. I told myself that was simply how life worked now. Children built new families and drifted away from old ones. Still, some nights the quiet inside my apartment felt so large it seemed to swallow the entire room whole. I finished the last spoonful of soup and carried the bowl to the sink. Outside, snow continued falling steadily. Across the city, somewhere beyond those icy streets, an old man sat wearing my boots. The next morning, Chicago looked buried beneath a sheet of white glass. Snow covered parked cars up to their tires, and the sidewalks outside my apartment building had turned into uneven paths of gray slush and ice. I left for work 30 minutes early because walking without proper winter boots took twice as long. I wore 2 pairs of thick socks under my old canvas shoes, but the cold still slipped through almost immediately. By the time I reached the bus stop, my feet burned with that deep numb ache only winter could create. A teenage boy waiting beside me glanced down at my shoes with quiet confusion before looking away. I pretended not to notice. Miller's Market was unusually busy because of the storm warning. Customers rushed through the aisles filling carts with bottled water, canned soup, batteries, and frozen dinners as though the world might end before morning. I spent most of the day standing behind register 4 with aching knees and frozen toes hidden beneath the counter. Around noon, my manager Karen handed me a paper cup of coffee without saying much. She was younger than my son by at least 10 years, But sometimes she looked at me with the same careful pity people reserved for injured animals. "You should really get proper boots in weather like this," she said quietly while checking receipts beside my register. "You could get sick." I smiled politely and wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "I will eventually." It was easier than explaining the truth. Good winter boots in Chicago cost more than half my grocery budget for the month. The pair I gave away had lasted nearly 15 years because Harold took care of them every winter with leather polish and cedar inserts. After he died, I kept polishing them myself even when the soles started thinning. Some habits stayed alive long after the people connected to them disappeared. Near the end of my shift, I noticed an older man standing near the front window watching the snow outside. First I thought it might be him. The same silver hair. The same stillness in his posture. My chest tightened unexpectedly. But when the man turned around, he was someone else entirely. Just another tired customer waiting for a taxi. I felt strangely disappointed. The feeling followed me all the way home. That evening the wind grew even stronger. Snow scraped against the apartment windows while the radiator hissed unevenly beside the couch. I sat wrapped in a blanket reading an old mystery novel I had already finished twice before, mostly because it helped pass the silence. Around 7:30, someone knocked softly on my door. I froze for a moment. Almost nobody visited me anymore without calling first. Another knock came, gentle but steady. I stood slowly and crossed the apartment, my heart beating harder than it should have. When I opened the door, the old man from the park stood in the hallway holding a small brown paper bag against his chest. Snowflakes clung to his silver hair and dark wool coat. But what shocked me most was that he was wearing the boots. My boots. They looked cleaner than they had in years. The leather had been polished carefully until it shined beneath the hallway light. "I hope I am not disturbing you," he said calmly. "The cashier at the grocery store across from the park remembered seeing you there last night. She told me this building might be yours." I stared at him speechless for several seconds before finally stepping aside. "You found me." He nodded once. "I wanted to return something." He lifted the paper bag slightly. The smell reached me immediately. Fresh bread. Still warm. "It is not much," he added softly, but it felt wrong accepting kindness without offering any in return. I looked down at the polished boots again. The leather gleamed like new beneath the dim hallway light, and suddenly I remembered Harold sitting by the radiator every January evening carefully rubbing polish into those same seams while snowstorms moved across Chicago outside our window. My throat tightened unexpectedly. "You should come inside," I said quietly. "It is too cold to stand out there." The apartment suddenly felt smaller with another person inside it. Not uncomfortable exactly, just unfamiliar. I could not remember the last time someone sat at my kitchen table. After sunset, the old man removed his coat carefully and folded it over the back of the chair before settling down across from me. Close, he looked older than I first thought. Early 70s perhaps. Deep lines framed his mouth, and exhaustion lingered beneath his pale blue eyes in a way that sleep alone could not fix. Still, there was something composed about him. Even sitting beneath the weak yellow light of my tiny kitchen, he carried himself like someone who once belonged in expensive places. I poured 2 cups of coffee while he placed the brown paper bag gently on the table. Inside was a fresh loaf of sourdough bread from a bakery downtown that I knew charged almost $8 a loaf. I stared at it briefly before looking back at him. "This is too much for a pair of old boots," I said softly. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. I suspect the boots mattered less than the gesture. Snow rattled softly against the windows while the radiator hissed in uneven bursts beside us. For a few moments neither of us spoke. The silence did not feel awkward though. It felt strangely calm, like 2 tired people resting at the same station after traveling very long roads alone. Finally, he wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked down at the steam rising between us. "My name is Victor," he said quietly. "Margaret," I replied. He nodded once, repeating my name as though testing its sound. "Thank you again, Margaret." I waved the gratitude away gently. Everyone needs help sometimes. His eyes lifted toward mine then, thoughtful and unreadable. "That is true," he said. "But most people only believe that when the person needing help looks like someone worth saving." The words settled heavily between us. I looked down at my coffee. In all honesty, I had almost walked past him myself that night. If Harold had not taught me years ago to pay attention to lonely people, perhaps I would have kept going like everyone else. Victor reached into the pocket of his coat and carefully removed a small silver watch with a cracked leather strap. He checked the time before sliding it back again. Even that simple movement felt practiced and elegant. Not flashy. Refined. I noticed details then that I had missed in the park. His fingernails were clean despite the cold. His posture remained perfectly straight even after hours outdoors. And his voice carried none of the roughness I expected from someone living on the streets. Curiosity stirred quietly inside me. "Have you been homeless long?" I asked before I could stop myself. He smiled faintly at the question but did not seem offended. "Long enough to learn how quickly people stop looking you in the eye." The answer told me almost nothing, yet somehow everything at the same time. I studied him carefully across the kitchen table. "You do not sound like someone who belongs out there." His expression shifted slightly then. Not anger. More like recognition. "Neither do you," he replied softly. I laughed under my breath for the first time in days. A small laugh. Rusty from lack of use. "Trust me," I said. "This apartment and I belong together." Victor glanced around the room slowly. The faded curtains. The old lamp near the couch. Harold's armchair beside the window. His eyes lingered there briefly before returning to me. "No," he said quietly. "This place feels temporary. Like someone waiting for life to begin again." The words caught me off guard. Nobody had spoken to me that honestly in years. Most conversations in my life had become surface level after Harold died. Cashiers. Doctors. Polite neighbors in hallways. Even my son rarely asked how I was truly doing anymore. But somehow this stranger sitting in my kitchen looked directly through the silence I had spent years building around myself. Outside, snow continued falling steadily across Chicago, while warm coffee steamed between us beneath the dim apartment light. For the first time in a very long while, the loneliness inside the room felt smaller. Victor stayed for nearly an hour that night. We talked about ordinary things at first because ordinary things felt safer. Coffee. Winter storms. The terrible condition of Chicago traffic whenever snow covered the roads. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did answer, his words carried the calm precision of someone who had spent most of his life being heard carefully by other people. At one point, I mentioned that I used to teach third grade at a public school near Evanston before retiring, and something softened in his expression. "Teachers shape more lives than they ever realize," he said quietly. "Most people never thank them properly." I smiled faintly. Most 8-year-olds are not exactly focused on gratitude. A low chuckle escaped him then. Warm. Genuine. The sound surprised both of us. The apartment somehow felt different after that. Less like a place waiting for silence to return. Around 9 o'clock, Victor finally stood and reached for his coat. Snow still drifted outside the windows in slow white currents beneath the streetlights. "I should go before the buses stop running," he said. I frowned slightly. "Do you have somewhere warm tonight?" For the first time since arriving, he hesitated. "Just briefly. I will manage." It was not really an answer. I looked toward the couch near the radiator. The springs squeaked loudly whenever anyone sat down, and one armrest leaned slightly lower than the other, but it was warm enough. Harold used to fall asleep there during late baseball games every summer. "You could stay here tonight," I said before I had time to reconsider. "The couch folds out." Victor looked genuinely startled. "Margaret, you barely know me." "I know you are cold," I replied simply. "And I know Chicago weather does not care about pride." For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then he lowered his eyes, almost as though the offer embarrassed him somehow. "You are an unusual woman," he said quietly. I laughed softly under my breath. "No. Just old enough to know people need each other sometimes." He accepted the offer after that without another argument. I found spare blankets in the hallway closet while he stood awkwardly beside the couch, clearly unaccustomed to receiving kindness. Most people assume poverty looks like anger or desperation. Sometimes it looks more like shame. I changed into my flannel nightgown in the bedroom and turned off the apartment lights one by one before settling beneath my blankets. Through the cracked bedroom door, I could see the soft glow of the lamp beside the couchware. Victor sat quietly staring out the window into the falling snow. For some reason, the sight unsettled me emotionally in ways I could not explain. Maybe because loneliness recognizes itself in other people. Maybe because he looked less like a homeless man and more like someone hiding from a life he no longer trusted. The next morning I woke to the smell of coffee. Real coffee. Rich and fresh. For a brief moment, disoriented from sleep, I thought Harold was in the kitchen again. The ache that followed hit my chest before I even opened my eyes fully. Then memory returned. Victor. I slipped on my robe and stepped carefully into the hallway. Victor stood near the stove pouring coffee into 2 mugs while snowlight spilled softly through the kitchen window behind him. Somehow he had managed to shave overnight, and without the silver stubble shadowing his face, he looked even more refined than before. Older certainly, but unmistakably distinguished. "I hope you do not mind," he said calmly when he noticed me. "I found the coffee grounds." I stared at the mugs for a second before smiling faintly. Most guests do not make breakfast their first morning. Most guests are not trying to repay impossible debts. I shook my head gently and sat down at the kitchen table while warmth from the coffee drifted through the small apartment. Outside, snowplows pushed through the streets below. Somewhere down the block, children laughed while throwing snowballs before school. The city had started moving again after the storm. Victor placed a plate of toasted bread beside me before sitting across from me once more. Then, after a long silence, he asked a question that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. "Why does your son not visit you anymore?" The question lingered between us longer than I expected. Steam curled upward from our coffee cups while snowlight reflected softly across the kitchen table. Victor did not ask the question with curiosity or judgment. He asked it the way someone asks about an old scar they recognize in another person. Carefully, I wrapped both hands around my mug and stared down at the dark coffee for several seconds before answering. "Life gets busy," I said. Quietly. The moment the words left my mouth, I almost smiled at myself. It was the same excuse lonely parents across America repeated every day to protect themselves from the truth. Victor leaned back slightly in his chair but did not interrupt. Outside, a city bus groaned through the slush below my apartment window. Somewhere down the hall, a neighbor's television played too loudly through thin walls. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning. Yet something about sitting across from this stranger made honesty feel less frightening than usual. I exhaled slowly. Daniel was different before he got married, I admitted at last. Not perfect, but softer. Victor listened silently. After Vanessa came along, things changed little by little. At first it was harmless things. Missed phone calls. Canceled dinners. Holidays shortened because they had other plans. I paused briefly, tracing my finger along the warm rim of the coffee mug. Then eventually I started feeling like a guest in my own son's life. Victor's expression remained calm, though I noticed something tighten faintly around his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. "Vanessa likes nice things," I continued quietly. "Expensive restaurants. Luxury condos downtown. Vacation photos on social media every few months." A faint laugh escaped me then, though there was no humor in it. I suppose a retired schoolteacher living in an old apartment does not fit very well into that picture. Victor folded his hands together thoughtfully. "And your son allows this distance?" I looked toward the snow-covered window for a moment before answering. "I do not think these things happen all at once. People drift slowly, quietly, like ice breaking apart on a lake." The room fell silent again after that. Victor lowered his gaze to the table, lost briefly in thoughts he did not share. There was something heavy behind his silence now. Not pity. Memory. I realized then that whatever had brought him onto that frozen park bench likely had little to do with money or bad luck. Pain leaves certain shadows in people no matter how expensive their clothes once were. "You asked because something similar happened to you," I said softly. He looked up. Immediately. For the first time since meeting him, I saw genuine surprise cross his face. Then slowly he smiled to himself. "You notice more than most people, Margaret. Teachers spend 40 years studying faces." He glanced down at the untouched piece of toast on his plate before finally speaking. "I have a daughter," he said quietly. "Or perhaps it is more accurate to say I raised one." The wording caught my attention immediately. "You are not close?" His jaw tightened almost invisibly. We were once. He stopped there, as though the rest of the sentence belonged to another lifetime entirely. I did not push further. Some grief arrives before people are ready to name it aloud. Instead, I stood and carried our empty coffee mugs to the sink. The radiator hissed softly while snow continued drifting outside the apartment windows in slow white spirals. Behind me, Victor spoke again. You know, he said quietly, when someone spends enough years being valued only for what they provide, they begin wondering whether anyone would still care about them without those things. I turned slowly toward him. He sat perfectly still beneath the pale morning light, hands folded neatly together, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the small kitchen walls. Suddenly I understood something important. The man sitting across from me was not broken by poverty. He was broken by disappointment. And somehow I suspected that wound ran far deeper. Victor stayed 3 more days in my apartment after that storm. Somehow it happened naturally, without discussion or formal invitation. The roads remained dangerous from the ice, the shelters downtown were overcrowded, and each morning simply rolled quietly into the next. By the second evening, his coat hung beside mine near the front door as though it had always belonged there. I found myself adjusting to his presence faster than I expected. There was comfort in hearing another person move through the apartment again. The soft sound of someone making coffee before sunrise. A quiet voice saying good morning across the kitchen table. Small things most people take for granted until they disappear. Victor never spoke much about himself, but little. Details escaped now and then. He knew wines by region without checking labels. He corrected a news anchor once during a financial report without even looking up from the newspaper. And whenever business stories appeared on television, something unreadable passed briefly through his expression before he changed the channel. I noticed all of it. Teachers notice patterns for a living. On Friday evening, I returned home from work exhausted after an unusually long shift at the grocery store. My legs ached from standing all day, and freezing rain had soaked through my shoes before noon. When I reached the apartment building, a sleek black car sat parked beside the curb with its headlights glowing against the gray slush. The vehicle looked wildly out of place on our street. Everything about it screamed money. Clean polished paint. Tinted windows. A driver standing beside the rear door in a dark overcoat despite the freezing wind. I slowed immediately. People like that did not come to my neighborhood unless they were lost. The driver glanced toward me briefly before lowering his gaze again with professional stillness. Unease settled quietly in my stomach as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. The front door stood slightly open when I reached the hallway. My heart skipped once. Victor, I called softly while stepping inside. The apartment looked exactly the same except for one thing. Victor stood near the window wearing a charcoal gray suit so perfectly tailored it seemed impossible to belong to the same man I found sitting barefoot in the snow only days earlier. For several seconds I could not speak at all. Gone were the worn coat and exhausted appearance. His silver hair had been neatly trimmed. A polished watch rested against the cuff of his sleeve. Even the way he stood had changed. Straighter somehow. Powerful. The apartment suddenly felt too small around him. Victor turned toward me slowly, and for the first time since meeting him, uncertainty crossed his face. Margaret, he said quietly. I stared at him in stunned silence. Every strange detail from the past few days crashed together at once inside my mind. The expensive bread. The elegant manners. The calm voice. The watch. The posture. Who are you? I whispered finally. He exhaled slowly before answering. My full name is Victor Ashford. The name hit me immediately. Anyone living in Chicago recognized it. Ashford Capital. Hotels. Real estate. Investment firms. The Ashford family name appeared on buildings downtown in letters taller than most people's apartments. I felt the blood drain from my face. No, I said under my breath. That is not possible. Victor held my gaze quietly. I understand why you would think that. I looked toward the black car waiting below the apartment window, and then back at the man standing inside my kitchen. You are telling me you are Victor Ashford? Yes. My knees weakened enough that I had to grip the back of the chair beside me. Images flashed through my mind in fragments. The frozen park bench. His soaked socks. My boots in the snow. But why? The question escaped harsher than I intended. Why would someone like you be out there like that? Victor lowered his eyes briefly before speaking. Because I needed to know whether anyone still saw value in a man once everything impressive was stripped away. Silence filled the apartment after that. Heavy. Unreal. Then Victor looked back at me with something painfully sincere in his expression. Margaret, you were the only person who stopped. For the rest of that evening, I could barely look at Victor without feeling disoriented. My tiny apartment suddenly held two completely different realities at once. The quiet man who drank coffee at my kitchen table and folded blankets carefully every morning. And Victor Ashford, the billionaire whose name stood on skyscrapers across Chicago. He seemed to understand my confusion because he gave me space after revealing the truth. He sat calmly near the window while city lights shimmered against the snow outside, waiting without pressure for my thoughts to settle. Finally, I lowered myself slowly into the chair across from him. You really slept on a park bench? I asked softly. Victor nodded once. Several nights. Why would anyone choose that? His eyes drifted toward the falling snow beyond the glass. Because comfort can hide the truth from people. The answer sounded strange at first, yet somehow deeply honest. He rested his hands together carefully before continuing. After my wife passed away 5 years ago, my daughter Claire and her husband slowly became more involved in my companies. First I was grateful. I believed family should remain close. His voice stayed calm, but something tired moved beneath it now. Then eventually every conversation became about money, investments, control, future inheritance. He smiled faintly to himself without warmth. One day I realized nobody around me spoke to Victor anymore. They only spoke to Ashford. The room fell silent again. I thought about Daniel and Vanessa, about rushed holiday dinners and polite smiles stretched thin over obligation. Different worlds perhaps. Same loneliness. Victor exhaled slowly. 3 months ago I left without informing anyone except my attorney. I wanted to disappear long enough to see whether kindness still existed when people believed I had nothing to offer them. He glanced toward me then. Most people never even slowed down. Shame touched me unexpectedly because I remembered almost walking past him too. I nearly kept going that night, I admitted quietly. But you did not. His words landed softly between us. Not dramatic. Just true. The following afternoon, Victor asked if I would join him for dinner downtown. The request alone made me nervous. I owned exactly 2 dresses suitable for restaurants nicer than Miller's Diner, and both were over 10 years old. Still, something in his expression felt less like charity and more like companionship. I finally agreed after nearly 20 minutes of hesitation. At 6:30 sharp, the same black car arrived outside my apartment building. The driver opened the door respectfully as though transporting schoolteachers from old brick apartments happened every day. Downtown Chicago glittered beneath fresh snow as we drove past luxury hotels and glowing storefronts dressed for winter. Everything looked impossibly distant from my normal life. Victor waited for me outside a restaurant overlooking the river. This time he wore a dark wool overcoat and silver tie that matched the snowfall gathering lightly across his shoulders. People passing on the sidewalk recognized him immediately. I saw it in their faces. Sudden attention. Quiet whispers. Phones subtly lifted for photographs. Yet Victor barely seemed to notice. Inside, warm golden light reflected against crystal glasses and polished marble floors. I felt painfully underdressed despite my nicest navy blue dress and pearl earrings Harold bought me years ago. A young hostess led us toward a private dining room overlooking the river. Halfway there I froze. Sitting near the back of the restaurant beneath hanging chandeliers were Daniel and Vanessa. My son looked up first. Confusion crossed his face instantly, then shock. Vanessa's expression changed even faster the moment she recognized Victor beside me. She straightened immediately in her chair, smoothing her hair while whispering something hurriedly to Daniel. I felt my stomach tighten. Victor, I whispered nervously, why are they here? He remained calm. Too calm. Because some truths are easier spoken in the presence of witnesses. Before I could respond, Daniel hurried toward us with disbelief written across his face. Mom, he said breathlessly. Then his eyes shifted toward Victor beside me, and his entire posture changed. Respect. excitement, calculation. Mr. Ashford, he said quickly, extending his hand. I cannot believe this. We have actually followed your company for years. Victor looked at the offered hand for one long second before finally shaking it politely. Then he spoke with quiet precision. Interesting, he said. Your mother never mentioned you called often enough to know what was happening in her life. The silence after Victor's words felt heavier than the snow outside. Daniel lowered his hand slowly while confusion spread across his face. Vanessa forced a brittle smile almost immediately. The kind people wear when panic hides beneath politeness. Margaret, she said quickly, stepping forward. You never told us you knew Mr. Ashford. Her voice sounded sweeter than I had heard in years. Too sweet. I looked at her carefully beneath the warm restaurant lights and realized something painful. Some people only recognize value once the world attaches wealth to it. Victor remained perfectly calm beside me. Your mother and I met during the snowstorm, he said evenly. Daniel blinked several times. You mean recently? Yes. Victor glanced toward me briefly before continuing. She offered kindness when she believed I had absolutely nothing. Vanessa laughed nervously under her breath. That sounds exactly like Margaret. She has always had such a generous heart. The sentence almost startled me. Not because it was false. Because I could not remember the last time she spoke warmly about me at all. Victor seemed to notice the same thing. Interesting, he said quietly. Margaret described your relationship somewhat differently. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Look, things have just been busy lately. Victor nodded slowly as though considering the explanation. Then he asked the question with such calm precision it silenced the entire conversation. Busy enough to forget your mother walks home alone in Chicago winters without proper boots? Daniel's face drained of color immediately. Vanessa opened her mouth before closing it again without speaking. Around us, elegant conversations continued beneath chandeliers and soft piano music, but suddenly our small corner of the restaurant felt painfully exposed. I looked down at my hands, embarrassed by the attention even though none of this had been my doing. Victor turned slightly toward me then. His expression softened in a way I had never seen before. Margaret gave her only pair of winter boots to a stranger sitting in the snow because she believed no human being deserved to freeze alone. His voice stayed quiet, but every word landed clearly. Most people with far more money passed me without looking twice. Daniel stared at me speechless. Real shame finally appeared in his eyes for the first time in years. Not shame because of wealth or status. Shame because another man had seen what he failed to see himself. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Victor placed one gentle hand against the back of my chair. Come, he said softly. Dinner is waiting. The private dining room overlooked the frozen Chicago River glowing beneath. Thousands of city lights. Crystal glasses reflected gold across white tablecloths, while snow drifted slowly outside enormous windows. I had never eaten anywhere remotely this expensive in my life. Yet somehow, sitting across from Victor that evening felt less uncomfortable than sitting at holiday dinners with my own family. Because for the first time in years I did not feel invisible. Halfway through dinner, Victor reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and placed a small envelope gently on the table beside my plate. What is this? I asked quietly. An offer, he replied. Inside was paperwork for a charitable foundation Victor planned to open across Chicago focused on winter shelters and support programs for elderly homeless residents. My eyes widened as I continued reading. Near the bottom of the page was my name, Margaret Hale, Community Director. Victor, I whispered stunned. I cannot run something like this. Yes, he said calmly. You can. I looked up at him. Why would you trust me with something so important? He smiled then. Not the polished smile of a billionaire standing before cameras. A smaller one. Real. Because character reveals itself most clearly when nobody important is watching. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Outside, snow continued drifting across the river, while warm golden light filled the room around us. For the first time since Harold died, the future no longer looked like an empty apartment waiting in silence. 3 months later, spring finally reached Chicago. Snow melted from sidewalks. Trees along Grant Park slowly turned green again. One quiet afternoon, Victor and I walked past the same frozen bench where we first met months earlier. Only now sunlight warmed the pavement, and children laughed nearby while feeding birds along the water. Victor stopped beside the bench and handed me a small box wrapped carefully in brown paper. Inside sat a brand new pair of leather winter boots. Soft black leather. Warm lining. Beautiful craftsmanship. I looked up at him speechless. Victor smiled gently beneath the spring sunlight. No one who saves another soul should ever have to walk alone again.